a bruise deep inside me. The king and his huge retinue set off the next day on their progress round the kingdom. It would take them weeks. I was glad to be seeing the back of Percy Howard and his uncle. I'd be glad to see the back of everyone. Hampton Court was in a bustling, cheerful uproar as the court prepared to follow the king, and I sidled from group to group in search of my Uncle Caro. I was desperate to find my father after what Percy had told me. My uncle swept one hand across the other in annoyance when he saw me, as if he wanted to be done with me. "My lord, will my father be joining you when you travel with his majesty?" "Most certainly not," he snapped. "Your father remains in London tidying up my business." "Thank you, my lord," I bowed. That was all I needed to know. I could write to my father at his lodgings. He was alone, and surely no one would be watching him while the king was away. The king and his followers left with much blaring of trumpets and beating of drums, waving of flags, ringing of bells, so that everyone on their route would know they were coming, and would line the riverbank and the lane sides cheering and hurrahing the huge procession. I watched them away, and then turned back to the quiet court and my duties. The little prince was exhausted and overexcited. Mother Jack told me he needed rest that morning. "Go to your studies for a bit," she told me. She yawned like a cat. "Isn't it peaceful now that's all over?" Now at last I had time to myself. I could write to my father and warn him, but still I didn't. I chewed the end of my quill, chasing words in my head the way a cat chases birds, watching them fly away. I just didn't know where to start. I hadn't seen him since the day in Westminster Palace when Uncle Caro had presented me to King Henry. He had never written to ask me about my life at Hampton Court. He hadn't even told me about Matthew being found and buried. All that was like a bruise deep inside me, which hurt every time my thoughts wandered near it. And anyway, I told myself, how would I know for sure that my letter wouldn't be read first by one of the watchers that Percy had whispered to me about? Was it true? Was I being watched in everything I did? I felt cold and lonely. Maybe Percy was just trying to bully me because he was jealous of my horse and my falcon. He was only a boy. How could he know whether my family was in danger? I decided not to risk sending a letter. It was easier. And yet, I longed to see my father again. I longed to be home. Longed for it to be the way it was before Matthew died. For everything to be the way it used to be. And then, one day, something completely unexpected happened. I was in the long gallery near the prince's chambers, playing football with him, with a stuffed bag of royal rags. He tottered after it, tripping over his skirts, squealing with laughter every time I kicked the ball out of the way. Then a footman came down and murmured to Mother Jack that there was a visitor with a letter from Lord Caro, and she nodded to him to let the visitor come up. She scooped up the prince and handed him to a lady in waiting to take away, and told me to follow her to the receiving room. The visitor was ushered in. It was my father. He went straight to Mother Jack and handed her a letter, while I dithered behind her, scuffing the cloth wool about between my feet as I was trying to polish the floor with it. Mother Jack read the letter and wrinkled her nose in the rabbity way she has, and tossed her head as if to say, "What do we care? I can manage without him. Take him." And then she pressed a coin into my hand and said, "Lord Caro says His Majesty has already agreed that you may be relieved of your duties for a short while. You may go. I'll send for you when I have to. Go well, and keep safe, young William." "Where?" I asked, catching my father's eyes at last. "Home." I wanted to hug him. I wanted to race down that long gallery, whooping and cheering and skipping. Instead, I bowed and went quietly to my room and ordered my servant to put together some clothes for me. He loaded them into the black Tudor saddlebag and followed me to the stable yard where my father was waiting. A stable boy led my horse out. Tudor stepped out proudly, as if eager, as if he was on display in front of the whole court. I stood watching my father, trying not to smile. "That's a fine horse you have," he said, surprised. "A real beauty." I mounted slowly, keeping my face straight. I waited till he was mounted on his own horse and trotting beside me away from Hampton Court. And then I told him, "He's a present from the king." And then I couldn't help it. I laughed out loud. I was so full of pride and joy. I kicked Black Tudor on, so my father had to canter to keep up with me. It was like the old days again, racing into the wind over the meadows of home. And there, beside us, cantering with us, his head thrown back and his mouth open as if he was simping the wind, urging us to go faster, faster, was Matthew. Does my father see him too? I wondered. Is he there for both of us? And as soon as I thought that, Matthew had gone. But he had left my happiness with me. I imagined the orchard with apples swelling on the trees, and the swallows darting and swooping round the barns, and the cry of seagulls. Home, home, I was going home. Why are we going home? I asked Father eventually, pulling up Tudor so I could trot beside him. How long will we be staying? He was out of breath with the race and just shook his head. I don't know, he said at last, wiping the gleam of sweat from his brow. I received an order from Lord Carrow to return to Montague Hall with you. That's all I know. He has business for us there, and when it's completed, no doubt we'll receive a letter telling us to return to our duties. Why do we have to do everything he says? I asked angrily. Even though I was excited about going home, I hated to think that we had been ordered to go there. My father didn't even bother to reply to that. We have a long, long journey ahead of us, he said. We'll ride hard and rest at inns on the way. We can visit the home of my good friend de Crecy. He may be at Greenwich, or even away with His Majesty, but his wife will make us welcome there again. He glanced at me, a little twitch of a smile on his lips. I heard from Lord Carrow that the king is pleased with you. He must be to have given you this horse. And a falcon. I was jittery with pride then. I glanced at my father to see if he was proud of me, but he kept himself stern and tight. He's a generous man. Yes, he is generous, but he's also fat, smelly, and mad. I laughed at the shocked expression on Father's face. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. It's all right. No one's following us, and no one can hear us. I raised myself on the stirrups. Fat, smelly, mad, and old, I shouted. In the distance, I could see two figures through the shimmering heat haze sitting at the side of the road. He'd have you rotting in the tower if he heard you were talking like that, my father muttered. And there's plenty who would take great pleasure in telling him, the Howard boy, for a start. My smile turned to a ghost of itself on my lips. I gripped Tudor's reins tightly. You know about him. I don't listen to gossip, Father said, but people enjoy telling me how much the boy hates you. He's jealous, that's all, but he's dangerous. They're a dangerous family. Father, Percy Howard tells me that you were being watched. Both of us. Did you know that? Is it true? I expect it is. Everyone is being watched these days. But aren't you afraid of what might happen to you? For a long time, my father was silent. The two figures emerged from the heat haze, a boy and girl dressed in brown, simple clothes. Their feet were bare. They were standing up now, wary as if they'd been walking for miles, and as we drew up to them, I pulled a coin from my purse and tossed it down to them. I didn't even look at them. I had no idea what kind of coin it was. It was the one Mother Jack had given me to spend on my travels. I did it to please my father. He didn't even seem to notice. He had closed up inside himself again, and when he spoke, it was as if I wasn't even there. When your mother died, he said, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. Only my faith and my belief in God and my prayers kept me going. And then I lost Matthew, my fine, loving, lovely son, Matthew. I slipped, I blurted out. I couldn't help it. I grabbed at him. I didn't know what I was doing. I had never cried in front of Father for Matthew before. I hadn't been able to. I was so wrapped round with guilt. Now the tears streamed down my cheeks, burning tears that blurred the trees and the sky around me. I couldn't brush them away. I couldn't stop them. My father kept looking ahead of him, staring into the dark, hurting terror of his past. Without my faith, I would not have been able to carry on, he said. My only comfort was in praying as I had prayed every day of my life. I cannot change now. But not Lord Peter Carew, not Lord Thomas Howard, not even King Henry himself will change my belief that the Pope is the true father of the Holy Catholic Church. It is all that matters to me.